So whenever you talk about culture, you've got to go back to the beginning. And in this case, we're going to go all the way back to the period when the Pilgrims arrived in the Mayflower. And I know that seems like a long way back, but I think it's important to realize that the first people usually define the culture. And the way that the Pilgrims did this is by exploring certain assumptions about belief. And if you look at the word the American Creed, or the concept of the American Creed, and the idea that this is a secular religion, it's going to begin with religion, and then it's going to actually deal with the way that the American politics is understood. So even though we think of our way of looking at ourselves as non-religious, the fact of the matter is, when you look at it a little more carefully, there's a kind of a religious element to the way that we look at ourselves as a people and as a nation. So we're going to go back and just look very briefly at what the colonies looked like back then. The Mass Bay Colony grant, which eventually is going to be given, was an area that basically ran north of the border of Connecticut. But before this, the Virginia colony was basically the line below that blue land where it says Massachusetts Colony, Bay Colony grant. That didn't exist then. And so when the Pilgrims left, they were actually heading towards New York, which is where previous Dutch settlers had already gone. And I think it's important to understand who these Pilgrims were. When you think about the Pilgrims, if you go back to what you might have learned in grade school, frequently the story is, okay, they were religious separatists and they weren't able to practice their religion, so they left England. That's partially true. But they left England primarily because they were being forced to pray in private, and they were looking for a place for more religious freedom, which they found in Holland. They went to Leiden. And so while they were looking for religious isolation and purity, they certainly found their freedom in the Netherlands. But the problem was they were working so hard. They were very poor, generally speaking. They were people that came from farming backgrounds. They were working in factories. They were being exploited. And because they had to work so much, the parents were working for so long, the kids were basically spending more and more time in a Dutch culture, which was largely secular. So the main reason for the Pilgrims leaving, which is interesting, it's like the story of a lot of other immigrants to this country. Primarily, it was because they had to make more money. They were economic migrants. Like most migrants to this country, they were looking for a material opportunity. But they were also worried about their children losing their religion. So it was really about the kids. I mean, it really was about the Pilgrim children, and they were trying to get them out of Holland and into a place where they could practice their religion, not only without interference, but without secular culture getting in the way. So if you look at the Mayflower was a boat that was about a little more than 80 feet long. That's not very big. A little more than 100 people on it and a dog. And they made an agreement. There weren't enough Pilgrims to basically pay for the trip. So they brought a bunch of other people with them. So it was about 50 Pilgrims, mainly families. And you had a group called the Strangers. And the Strangers were basically businessmen and adventurers and other Dutch people that just wanted to get out of Holland and were looking for an opportunity to get to New York. And these two groups of people did not like each other. So if you think of the Pilgrims as sort of evangelical Christians, the Strangers were kind of secular. They hated all of the praying and all of the overtly religious practices of the Pilgrims. So there was a lot of tension on the Mayflower. And I think it's analogous a little bit to the situation we find ourselves in today, with an evangelical group that's desperately trying to hold on to its religion, and another group of people that really finds that to be not what they want the country to be about at all. And so I think it's kind of interesting that the trip itself was rough, a lot of seasickness, a lot of dissension and disagreement between these two groups of people. But they realized that once they got there wouldn't be a problem, because they were all going to go to New York, and then the colonists would split into two groups. So what happened was they arrive at the northern part of Cape Cod. And if you've ever been to the outer side of Cape Cod, there are all of those beautiful sand dunes. It's exquisite. Remember, they arrive in the fall of 1620 in the area now that's up by Provincetown. And they didn't want to go north because if you remember here, they couldn't go north of that line. So if you look at that line, it sort of cuts through exactly where they were. They had to go south. So they started heading south, and they were using a plumb line, and they were dropping that plumb line to check the depth of the water as they were going off of Cape Cod. And of course, it's very deep all the way down as you come down by Truro, down towards Chatham. And if you don't know the Cape, that's down towards basically where the southernmost area is, where you see the Pollock Rip. Chatham is down in that area of the mainland. And so they're going down that direction, and everything's going great until they get to that area which is called the Pollock Rip, which is one of the most dangerous areas to sail in, because basically the entire tide, as it comes in and out, you have the whole Atlantic Ocean being sucked into Vineyard Sound, and all the water from the Vineyard Sound being sucked the other way. And it's very shallow, so there are all these shoals and huge breakers, and it's just a really dangerous place to be. So what happens is the Mayflower gets basically caught in this area, and of course the Pilgrims, being the Pilgrims, all start to pray, and the strangers, being the strangers, all start to swear at the Pilgrims, and all hell is breaking loose. And essentially what happens is, they're about to be sucked into the breakers, and the whole thing is about to end very badly, when all of a sudden, miraculously, according to the Pilgrims, right, God changes the direction of the wind. According to the strangers, dumb luck, right? The winds change. Christopher Jones, the captain, is able to get the Mayflower out of this tricky situation, and they start to sail north. Well, so what? Well, if you go north, you're outside of the Virginia Grant. Remember, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Grant doesn't exist yet. So they're going into the wilderness, and they're going into the wilderness together. And this is a disaster for both groups because they really don't want to be together. So the first agreement that ever gets made, I know this is before the United States, but it speaks to an important aspect of American governance and the idea behind government. Basically, to cut through the language here, if you look at this, we've undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of Christian faith. Obviously, the Pilgrims have a voice in this kind of religious language. Basically are talking about the idea of producing a constitution and an agreement that they will work together. So we enact, constitute, and frame just and equal laws, ordinance, acts, constitutions, and offices, which shall be convenient for the general good. And essentially what they're saying is we agree under God that we will agree to this constitution. So before we even get to a country, we have to basically get people to agree to a common set of laws. And the strangers and the Pilgrims have to agree to that. And this is a very important first step in terms of establishing the idea of American government. Now, shortly afterwards, about 10 years later, along come the Puritans, who are even more religiously motivated than the Pilgrims are. And when they come, similarly, before they arrive, John Winthrop, who was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, also was a religious leader. And essentially he said, look, we have to make up an agreement about what we're going to do here, because they were also starting to disagree about, exactly what they were going to be doing in this new colony, in this new place. Which at that point still was very much in the wilderness. So remember, in the first compact, we have this agreement to have a constitution under God. And in the second one, notice that he uses the word, those of you who've taken world religions will recognize this language, we entered into a covenant with him, with God, for his work, right? We are all doing God's work here. We must be knit together in this work as one person. We'll avoid the gendered language there. And we must bear one another's burdens. It's just like what we saw in the first Mayflower Compact, except for here, right, we are going to stay together in the body of Christ. There's all this very religious language. And then we get to the most important part, which is the last paragraph. If the Lord shall be pleased, he shall make us a praise and glory, for we must consider that we shall be as a city on the hill. A city on a hill. Right? We are going to be a beacon for liberty and for moral example to the rest of the world. The eyes of all people are upon us. Now, this is a ridiculous statement because nobody really knows that the Puritans are going in the first place. These are people that are probably their families know that they've left, but nobody else does. But they're viewing this as basically experiment in living on their own under God together. And if they do it well, they will become an example to all of humanity. And if they don't, they say, we shall be made a story and a byword, right, throughout the world. So in other words, everybody in the world is watching us, which seems silly at the time, but as Americans began to coalesce around a new government, when they began to form a country, they went back to this idea that this country was special, this country was unique, and this country was an example to the rest of the world. And that's called American exceptionalism, which is going to really be a key idea. And that idea is basically that we are the world, and that whatever happens to us is going to shape all of humanity. And this is a very heady idea. It's also extremely selfish, if you want to think of it that way. So when we get to the Declaration, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but of course every U.S. history class starts with it, and it really is our statement of our ideals. Before we have our own Constitution, we have a Declaration. And our Declaration is not a definition of who we are as a people by race. It's not, well, it sort of is. But it really is a definition of ourselves as an idea. We are not an ethnicity, we are an idea. Americans are the people that hold the truths of equality, at least equality of rights, and the rights given by God. Again, that's important because it goes back to this idea that rights are God-given. And remember, Jefferson was not a big believer in God. And the idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So again, the whole idea of the Declaration, which, as we know, came from Locke and from the British thinking around the British Civil War. This whole idea is that the government has to protect these rights at all costs. Now, when it comes to race, it's a little more complicated because pursuit of happiness in the context of 1776, if you're a Southerner, that means pursuit of happiness is property. And if you're a Southerner, property is slavery, right? Involves enslaved people. So the right of white people is literally being guaranteed by making black people property. I mean, so in this idea, there's an idealism here, and Jefferson sort of skates over it in the way that only Jefferson can, pointing out that, in fact, we're going to protect property, and we're going to protect that property and write it into the Constitution. That property is going to be enslaved people. So there's a lot to unpack here, not only that, but also the idea that there's going to be a deep distrust of government, which is going to run all the way through American history. If you look at where we are right now with Trump's challenging the election, and a lot of people believing that the election was fraudulent, that there was a long train of abuses and usurpations by Biden and his minions. They were right back to where we were there. And again, a lot of the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th they had the Declaration in their minds, if not literally, at least the idea behind it. So the Declaration, of course, the idea of the Declaration, as we think about it, is there's Jefferson, on Market Street writing this thing in candlelight, ironically with his slave Jupiter over his shoulder holding that candle. So literally the light that's being held for him to write this Declaration is being held by an enslaved person. So Jefferson is writing this with zero sense of irony, not even thinking about the ridiculousness of his writing about unalienable rights when the person who's serving him, and literally providing the light to write this document, is an enslaved person. So our idea of freedom blinds us to the realities of our lack of freedom. And of course, this idea of freedom is a ridiculous idea. In 1776, most of the world is very much unfree, defined by serfdom and absolute monarchs and all kinds of things like that. So we were dreamy idealists, just like Jefferson was. And I think it's important to think about this. So if you think about the three factors that we just looked at: one, the idea of a constitution under God; secondly, the idea that we are a model for all of humanity; and third, that we are a nation built on an idea and on ideals of freedom. And those are the core ideas of the American creed.